So welcome, let's have a seat and begin our panel. I'll begin by introducing, this will be about a half an hour conversation. Michael Graves is the 2012 Richard H. Driehaus laureate. He's a founding principal of Michael Graves and Associates and an emeritus professor at Princeton where he taught for 39 years. He's a native of Indianapolis, as you saw in the film, and trained at University of Cincinnati and at Harvard. He received the Rome Prize in 1960. Adele is here, Chatfield Taylor. As a scholar at the American Academy, where he's now a trustee, there was a tremendous influence on his career, as we've seen. Members of the Driehaus jury commended his commitment to the traditional city in its human scale, complexity, and vitality. We know his buildings, such as the Denver Central Library, his everyday objects, like the tea kettle I showed you, and the objects for Target. He calls himself a general practitioner. Among his many honors, Michael received the National Medal of Arts presented by Bill Clinton in 1999, only to have been eclipsed now by the Driehaus Prize. Next is Elizabeth Betsy Barlow Rogers, the 2012 Henry Hope Reed Award laureate. She is currently the president of the Foundation for Landscape Studies. Earlier, as New York City's Central Park Administrator and the founding president of the public-private Central Park Conservancy, she led the park's restoration and preservation from 1979 to 1996, and that has been profound. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's an author, as we heard, her most recent book, Writing the Garden. Do you have it there? Can you show us?
Oh, yeah.
Writing the Garden, there we go. Is a literary conversation across 2 centuries. Other books by her include works about romantic gardens, the history of landscape design, and Frederick Law Olmsted. Her book, The Forests and Wetlands of New York City, was nominated for a National Book Award. Betsy's from San Antonio. She has a bachelor's from Wellesley in art history and a master's in city planning from Yale. The American Society of Landscape Architects honored her with the Lagasse Medal in 2005, and she received the Rockefeller Foundation's 2010 Jane Jacobs Medal for Lifetime Achievement. And to my right, a man who is familiar to all of you, Paul Goldberger, a celebrated author and architecture critic. He's now with The New Yorker, where he writes the Skyline column since 1997. He was previously the architecture critic for the New York Times for 25 years, won a Pulitzer Prize. He is also the Joseph Urban Chair in Design and Architecture at the New School in New York, lectures widely around the country. Every time I've been practicing this, I keep saying lectures wildly around the country, which may be true.
Maybe let us hope, yes.
A wild lecturer. On architecture, design, historic preservation, and cities. He's taught at Yale in the Graduate School of Journalism, Yale in the School of Architecture, Graduate School of Journalism at Berkeley. He was awarded the President's Medal of the Municipal Art Society of New York, the Medal of the American Institute of Architects, and the Medal of Honor of the New York Landmarks Preservation Foundation. And his books include Why Architecture Matters, Building Up and Tearing Down, The City Observed, and the City Observed New York. So let's welcome our panel. Michael, I'd like to start by asking you a question. The Driehaus Prize at Notre Dame obviously celebrates work that's rooted in principles of classicism and tradition. And they thought it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on how, all of your thoughts on how tradition gets transmitted forward in its various ways. But before we get to that, let's just test the premise. Michael, how important do you think it is to draw upon history and tradition in producing architectural excellence? Do you think it's essential?
Well, I've always treated architecture as a language, and that means there is continuity, and we have to have, it's like literature, writers learn from other writers by reading their works and making plays on their works and in new things they write. Architects are often accused of copying other architects, but when you start to think of architecture as a language and as a compositional language as well, you start to understand that there is that sense of plagiarism or copying is non-existent, because you are making a room, you are making a group of rooms, you are making the passages to those rooms in ways that are essential to a code of conduct as we walk or live through those buildings, and they enhance our lives in ways that we never knew. I thought I would save this for my thank you, and I probably, my nurse Min says I shouldn't say anything political today, but so vote for Obama. I went on Thursday to the new museum. I hadn't seen Renzo's addition to the museum.
This is the Art Institute of Chicago.
The Art Institute. And I'm struck by the difference between the way he would do something and some of us would do something of a like size and so on. Not that it's a bad building, it's simply a building without a soul. I took that long walk along the passage that lets onto the galleries on the side, and I thought, it's empty. There's only a rather bad piece of sculpture of Harman Karzai here. What's going on? You know who he is? You should. Bob Beck knows. Anyway, I thought in the old days, this would have been the Hall of Armor. We don't do that anymore. But there wasn't, I suppose there's no reason for them to build the modern wing again, another edition, because they have this to fill up now. The work is, the art is not bad at all for what it tends to represent. I think the collection is exquisite for modern work. It was just that this big building, in its manner of trying to go away and be all light, is so present that it was daunting to me. I don't take that as negative criticism, folks. I just take that as a critical stance about how you treat rooms and think of that long corridor at the Art Institute and the one at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. The difference, the way a clear story light then infuses a space and gives particularity to that's below it is something we all learned from Lutjens and other people at Dulwich. It's just finally a way of thinking, Geoffrey.
Thank you. I want to give you each a chance here, and then we'll kind of have a whole freewheeling conversation. I have about 15 follow-up questions on that, but I want to bring the other folks in. Betsy, you describe your recent book, Writing in the Garden, as a literary conversation among writers, yourself included, over 200 years, maybe 300 years. You write reverently in your book about books and about writing. I know you have a great collection yourself of books on gardening. And so in this theme of like, how do we bring the past into the present, I got to thinking about that in relation to gardens, and I thought, you know, unlike buildings, unlike physical works of art, gardens are ephemeral. So in some ways, is writing even more essential or critical as a way of bringing tradition forward with gardens, especially with gardeners?
Well, writing can be ephemeral too, but we do have words that last on the page. But words, the correspondence between gardens and writings, words really, they do sprout from the writer's mind. And these are ideas, and of course all ideas are transmissions of culture over time. And I think that we write our cultural values into our landscapes. And by promoting my book, the writers that are really in conversation. They're talking very much about the same things. And the garden is, they write with passion because they're gardeners, and the nature is their partner, but it's also their necessary partner, and it's also their adversary. Mm-hmm. And as you say, gardens are ephemeral, but the things that gardeners face are not ephemeral. And so I just wanted to remark on one of the charming, humorous gardeners. I have divided this book into...
Yeah, the book is divided into different kinds of warriors and humorists and rhapsodists.
Right, spouses and women and all that. But anyway, Carl Chupik, whom you recognize
as a playwright,
as a playwright, yes. And he also was a gardener. And this is just a wonderful little classic called The Gardener's Year. And I'll read you a paragraph. The worst time for the gardener is when black frost sets in. Then the earth stiffens and dries to the bone. Deeper day by day and night after night, the gardener thinks of the roots which are freezing in the soil, dead and hard like stone, of twigs benumbed to the pith by the dry, icy wind, and of freezing buds which the plant packed all its goods and chattels into in the autumn. If I thought it would help, I would dress my holly in my own coat and put the juniper in my own trousers. For you, Pontic Azalea, I would take off my shirt. You, alum root, I would cover with a hat. And for you, tickseed, there's nothing left but my socks. You can make do with those. And then there's this charming, did you see this?
Yeah, there's a cartoon.
You can't see it out there, but his brother, Joseph, was a cartoonist, and so it was illustrated with these charming
it's funny because this is so timely, because those of you who are not from Chicago, we've had the most bizarre non-winter in Chicago. Winter never came. And spring, it's been 85 degrees here in Chicago for about the last month. That hasn't happened since records have been kept. Everything is sprouting, and we're all terrified that a black frost is going to come. So I have a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old. I'm going to have Disney princess underwear on all of my plants in front of my house. Unless the neighbors complain. I'll say Carl Chupik told me to do it. Paul, let me bring you in here. And this is vis-a-vis the Driehaus Prize. You're on the jury. We interviewed Peter Eisenman, whom you saw. One thing that didn't make it into the documentary, Michael, you'll like this. Peter said, Michael Graves doesn't have a classical bone in his body, which is ridiculous, but I think he was just trying to be provocative, as Peter can be. But that notwithstanding, I think many people are surprised by the selection of Michael Graves as the laureate this year. His work doesn't outwardly appear to be classical. You're on the jury, and you even drafted a statement explaining the choice. Can you talk to us about why Michael fits and is just the right choice for a Driehaus Prize?
Well, I think Michael made the case in the film better than we could have, in fact. He said what we believe to be the case and proved that it was, in fact, the case, that classicism is not a matter of imitation or replication. It can be, but that is, in fact, the least interesting aspect of it. And every great architect has been a creative force to one extent or another. And every prior Driehaus winner has been an architect of enormous creativity and invention. Some of them have used the language in a somewhat more literal fashion than Michael does. But it's a language. Michael believes profoundly in it. And it's true that he may invent a few words within that language that might not have been invented by a couple of the other prior Driehaus winners, but he still is very much devoted to that language. I mean, I've always felt there was something about Michael that in his in the early years of his postmodern work that had a kind of almost cubist and jazz-like sensibility, which he wove together with classicism in a way that was profoundly original, often very, very beautiful, and utterly and completely connected to the history of architecture in the same way that great jazz is connected to the history of music and is in fact not, you know, there's an enormous difference between the great modern composers of the early 20th century and great modern jazz artists and say John Cage or something like that. I mean, in one case they are taking that history and pushing it in a somewhat new direction, but very much rooted in what it was. So we felt, if I can speak for colleagues on the jury, that it was very important to make the case that commitment to tradition and belief in classicism do not necessarily have to equal replication. Sometimes they do, and in some cases there are those whose work is more literal, who are deservedly admired and who have been honored by this prize. But it shouldn't be limited by that. And that all great architecture acknowledges tradition to some extent, uses tradition to some extent or another, and the question is how honest are you going to be about admitting it. Michael is in fact quite honest about admitting it, and his work is a wonderful and ongoing proof of how a deep knowledge of and love of tradition and classicism can also yield things that are exciting and beautiful and new in a magical way.
It's interesting the way you put it, sort of admitting it. You know what I mean? It's almost like it's taking time to be able to actually say and embrace and own, you know, yes, there are classical roots in this.
Well, you know, also the myth of originality, which I think is one of the great bugaboos of architecture, of course. You know, everybody believing that you are reinventing things all the time. You're not, and the question is who. The division is sometimes between those who are honest enough to admit that and those who are in denial and pretend that they're. But the point we're making is almost the inverse of that. It's that, in fact, that within the continuity of tradition, there is also great invention. I think that's really the key point. It's the other way around. I mean, if you look really hard at Lutyens, who was mentioned earlier, I mean, it is bedazzling how inventive that was.
You show a breakfast room in your book, right?
Yes, I do. In Why Architecture Matters, I think the Lutyens' breakfast room is one of the most powerful, beautiful, and original rooms in all of Western architecture. In his house in Lincoln's Inn Fields in London, Sir John Soane's, which is now Sir John Soane's Museum.
Michael, let me bring you in here. What about just the label? You know, classicism. I mean, you went on the Grand Tour when you were. Was this when you were in Rome or after your time at the American Academy?
Well, first in Rome from 1960 to 62.
And the Grand Tour was sort of part of all that at that time?
Of course, and then every year the Academy would go back to Rome for one of their trustees meetings, and I would go on those trips. And so you were always traveling, so I got many, many years of really good scholarship from people at the Academy who would lead tours and so on. And the bar was set pretty high by those people, and you had to do your homework if you were going to get anything out of it. So yes, that Grand Tour continued with drawings that I would do and the like.
So the Grand Tour idea is, you know, all the great, you know, it was sort of a rite of passage. If you were going to be an architect or an artist, you had to go see the great antiquities of the classical world. You allowed us into your home in Princeton to interview you. It's filled with the souvenirs from the Grand Tour. But what about just the label? I mean, how important are these labels? Well, you're a classicist or you're a postmodernist. I mean, obviously your work is filled with, infused with, this was an enormous influence on you. But what about these labels? Are they of use?
They're of no use to me. That's why I jokingly one day said, I'm a general practitioner. I mean, don't put me in a closet. There are schools of architecture that have a closet for every movement. So you can choose your critic depending on whether you're a postmodernist, a deconstructivist, a classicist, a proto-modernist. I mean, it's nuts. Just do architecture. You know, that's all you have to do. Just do architecture.
And it's almost, this is really, Paul, what you were saying. You know, it's, you know, well, we have these terms, tradition, classicism, but you're really trying to kind of open it up and show that these influences are just in good architecture.
Yeah, I mean, I think these terms these days seem to mean about as much as liberal and conservative in politics mean. I mean, you know, they can mean anything people want them to mean. And we're better off talking about specific work and what makes it succeed or not succeed. I think that's what really Michael was getting at. I mean, Michael's work is very dependent on those very, very fundamental things about scale and proportion and space and light and detail and texture. And all of those things transcend style and they transcend labels. And you either do them well or you don't do them well. But you can do them well within many different languages.
Yeah.
For those the laymen in the audience that don't know about the so-called Grand Tour, the Grand Tour was from the 17th to the 19th century, what generally young men who were either scholars, architects, painters, sculptors, went to Europe and to Egypt, starting in Egypt and went from there to Greece, the Peloponnesus, and from there to Italy, and finally ended up in Naples, where they would look at the ruins of Pompeii, which were being excavated in their time. And those pieces that would come from the ground in Rome and Pompeii and other digs were then drawn by these people, and the sculptors then made drawings and measured drawings and had them made replicas of them, which are now, of course, for sale at Sotheby's and Christie's for unthinkable prices. But those were practically given away, taken home as trinkets to the parents of these kids from generally Great Britain.
I mean, the American Academy was really created, in effect, to encourage and support that kind of travel.
Absolutely.
Betsy, let me bring you in. You know, there is this sort of yin and yang, or these opposing forces. You know, as you said, the myth of originality. These modernists who basically wanted to wipe the slate clean and as if history didn't exist. And then, you know, organizations like Notre Dame, the Driehaus Prize, others who sort of have a contrary view about the importance of history. Is there any parallel to this in the world of landscape architecture in gardening?
Oh, absolutely. And I want to mention two examples. First of all, let's talk about Harvard as really the cradle of modernism, back with Gropius and bringing European modernism to this country. And at that time, the curriculum at Harvard in the landscape architecture school, which is, I think it's the oldest landscape architecture school in the country, the curriculum was very much Beaux-Arts, neo-traditional, Italianate kind of curriculum.
This is Harvard.
Harvard.
Yeah. Okay.
And there were 3 young Turks at Harvard at that time, and they were James Rose, whom his career was wonderful, but he's not as celebrated as the others. Garrett Ekbo, who was a West Coast architect, taught for many years at Berkeley, and then Dan Kiley, whom many of you do know. And the example that I want to bring up is Saarinen house in Columbus, Indiana, the Irwin Miller
house.
And Saarinen had it was a template, and so the proportions, it was modular, so all of the proportions in the house are within this classical framework, although the house itself is asymmetrical and not what you would think of as certainly a Beaux-Arts structure, but outside, Kiley then uses the same template, so there is a seamlessness. And he also was very influenced, of course, by Lenotre. One time he told me that he had no use for Olmsted, but that
no use for Olmsted.
No use for Olmsted, but Lenotre was his man. Anyway, so there are the wonderful alleys and trees, but always with this really seamless interface between indoors and outdoors, and they were conceived integrally. And for a little soapbox here, the architects sometimes are brought in after the fact, and it's considered, not quite the profession that architecture is, and so they trim around.
The landscape architects are brought in after the fact?
I meant landscape, yeah, I meant
Yeah.
landscape. They're brought in after the fact. And so they trim around the edges, which is what they're left to do, and that's so wrong because site planning is critical. Just quickly, since you've been talking about Lutyens, you have to mention Gertrude Jekyll and Lutyens. That's one of the really great partnerships.
Of all time,
Of
really.
all times, yes. And Gertrude Jekyll's in the book, and because she was a great garden writer as well. But that was a really fruitful partnership.
And one in which Lutyens happily acknowledged his debt to her, too, I think.
Absolutely. Right. But it has that wonderful integration of indoors and outdoors.
Betsy brings up Harvard, and I think it's important for the students in the room here today to understand the difference in the education you're getting and what we got in the 50s. It was an ahistorical time. There was no history taught. Even though I had Gideon at Harvard, we studied Scandinavian new towns. That's as close as we got to anything historical, which we're, of course, just finished. But I remember we were given a theater to do, and I went to the library and got Garnier's Paris Opera and put it on my desk, great elephant folder, and had the book open on my desk, and the then dean, Jose Luis Sert, came by and put his little chin over my raised desk, and he said, "Mr. Grace, what are you looking at?" And I said, "I'm looking at Garnier," and he said, with one great movement, he put his hands under the book like this, and shut it, and said, "You won't need that here at Harvard."
It was sort of like being caught with pornography. That's something, wasn't it, Michael?
That's right. I remember that I had done a drawing, a rendering for a building and a house, actually, that we had to use his structural system, the way he did the inverted vaults at the Miro Museum in France. And on the wall, I had found a Watteau that fit perfectly, so I clipped it out and pasted it on my wall in my rendering, or I might have even redrawn it, repainted it. I've forgotten which. And he went completely nuts. He said, "I've spent my entire life getting rid of this kind of trash of Watteau and Bouguereau and people of that ilk. And here you are putting in," I said, I couldn't help it. It was what the clients owned. So I had to accommodate it, sir. But it was a very different time. And people look at my early modern work and say, "You were a modernist." Well, you weren't anything else but a modernist in those days. That you were taught Le Corbusier at Harvard, and at Cincinnati I was taught Mies van der Rohe. So I had a choice. As a kid, that's what you're doing, and then you go to Rome, and life changes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wanted to ask about that because we're talking about how ideas get moved forward, and you're well known as someone who, as many architects do, you think with a pencil in your hand, And obviously you spent years in Rome drawing and drawing and drawing. So we talk about reading as a way of carrying ideas forward. How about drawing? For you, that was almost like reading, or maybe even more important than reading, perhaps?
They're not the same. But, I mean, you can't write without your brain, and you can't draw without your brain. It is, and you must do it all the time. You get rusty. It's one of the most magical and marvelous acts, filled with passion to get to draw. And I don't care whether one draws well or not, but just to get the ideas down. Le Corbusier said, you have to draw to remember. And Elizabeth reads a paragraph to us, and we will remember the concept of that paragraph now forever. We just take that with us because she read it to us. We could have read it, but without reading it, we don't know. Without drawing it and remembering that the pendentives in this room are speakers. Would the classicists, the pure classicists, agree with that? I doubt it, but here they are. And I think it's a marvelous way behind that grill to hide the speakers.
Paul, I think it's interesting, and we haven't talked about this at all, or much at all, about Michael as a product designer. You know, Betsy's a gardener, Paul's a product designer.
No,
in addition,
Michael's a product
I'm sorry, I got that backwards. Michael's a product designer, Betsy's a gardener. Do you see classicism in that too?
I certainly see tradition in Michael's product designs, absolutely, yes. I see an enormous love for the traditional form, sometimes interpreted in some of the Target stuff, beginning with the toaster, interpreted in a kind of lovingly, slightly cartoon-like, but very affectionate way, and also very user-friendly generally. And to say that a utilitarian kitchen object can also be emotionally engaging and can connect us to a larger tradition is, I think, the message that those pieces have, and still be very easy to use and comfortable to use.
This totally makes me think of what you say in your book, Why Architecture Matters, which is that you kind of talk about the continuum from a shed to a cathedral, a toaster being a very utilitarian object, but it sort of transcends into design at some point.
Right, and one of the questions is how self-consciously does it have to transcend into design? And I think one of the things Michael has been working to do in his product design is to avoid the degree of intense self-consciousness of a lot of modernist product design, which is, you know, super sleek and exquisite as an object to look at, but often so self-conscious that it is more, there's almost a narcissism to it.
It's so self-conscious.
Right, whereas Michael's stuff, I think, is not. Yeah.
The abstraction of modern product design won't allow you to know which end to pick up. I mean, it's that kind of thing. I had there was a dinner in Milan one night, and I was sitting next to the chairwoman of their AT&T called Inteltel. And she said, oh, it's so fortunate that I'm sitting next to you. I have a job for you. And I thought, this is great. And all I had to do was go to dinner. And she said, last week I was sitting with Giorgio Armani, and I asked him if he would design a designer telephone for me. And he said he would, and he's already working on it. And she said, would you design this is a crucial story for me, a designer telephone for me? And I said, no, I wouldn't. She said, why not? I said, I'll be happy to design a telephone for you, but not a designer telephone. I want a telephone for everybody. Because I don't know that designers are any smarter or more elite than anybody else who's smart and elite. And they ought to know how to use a telephone. And she agreed. And she said, you could do that? You put the two together? And I said, yes, and you'll sell a lot more telephones. I was just...
but maybe she wanted a bespoke telephone.
Yeah, I was...
that was one of a kind.
Right. I was just in a meeting in Texas relative to product design for some new clients, and they brought up the names Joseph. And if you don't know these people from London, you will. They are terrific designers. They're very, very clever to a fault, clever by twice. And they had done they showed me, they had done a kitchen timer. It looked like a hockey puck. And I picked it up and I said, what do I do with this? Now, if I'm arthritic, I can't pick it up to start with. But I picked it up, and here is this thing that was essentially an hockey puck. And I turned it, and oh yes, you could see these very slick numbers and so on. And you put it down, and they started to tick back. And then it went off, and bing, 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 and that was it. But I thought, there's the motion of the hand, there's picking it up, there's looking at it, there are all these things. And I said, well, we've just done a new timer. It's got a handle to turn. It's got a place to read what the time is. You know which is the bottom, which is the top, and so on. And it's not ugly, but it's not clever.
Right.
It's just very good-looking and useful, and therefore a design that I'm very happy with, and I like the experience of turning it. So it's a very different proposition, the abstraction that goes on today, whether in building or product design. And that's what you see. And if this were the Pritzker Award ceremony, we would be talking about 20-year-old architects who were designing museums that you could turn upside down without any work in it, and everything would be okay, and poor Paul would have to write glowing things about them. You know?
I don't know about, I have not always done that, Michael.
Because that's
And I was just about to say how much I liked your watches because I can tell the time.
Thank you.
Them too.
Well, that's what the watch manufacturer says. He said, these are watches by people who are artists, and these are a group of watches by Michael. You can actually tell time by them. And
It's wonderful.
as if there were an issue. Of course, that's what the bloody thing's for. You know, come on.
Well, our half-hour time is up, unfortunately. We could go on for a lot longer, but we have some awards to give away. Michael, you did allude to something that we won't have time to talk about, but it's worth noting, and it's also in the documentary. If you see it, he talks extensively about it. You said if you're arthritic, you couldn't turn this knob. And obviously, your work has undergone a major transformation since you were paralyzed. Michael is doing a lot now with designing hospital rooms that help us heal instead of interfere with our healing, homes for wounded warriors who are limited in mobility and so forth. So there's a whole other chapter of your career that...
Although, Geoffrey, if I can just interrupt one
Yes.
quick second. I would take issue with the word transformation, because I think, in fact, one of the things that's so important about what Michael's been doing is that it actually isn't different.
It's like
from
a
what it is.
continuity.
He's just expanded
Yeah.
the universe of what he's approaching, and he's taken a broader swath of things, but in fact, it's exactly the same attitude
Very,
he's
very
bringing
good
to that.
point. Yes, because it's always been about comfort and utility and accessibility and so forth.
And that's what makes Paul such a terrific critic, is that he doesn't write about architecture as fashion. He really writes about it as
Well,
coming
thank
out
you,
of a
Betsy.
great and noble tradition.
Well, let's thank our panel.